Hey, welcome to Building Your Own Theology. My name is Pastor Rich Vreeland, and I will be leading you on this journey of um, building a theology for yourself. If you are like me and you were away from the church for a while, you took that time to deconstruct or to come to understand the things that you didn't believe. And now that we find ourselves back in community and embracing our Christian faith anew, it's important to be able to articulate what we do believe. And so I know that part of my journey has been to come to understand what Christianity means to me, what Jesus means to me. How do I understand God and sin and the crucifixion, the resurrection? The way I view those things today is much different than the way I had been raised to view them and understand them. And so I hope that over the next several weeks, we can take a look at theology and to go through a journey of discovering what we believe. When I say what we believe, I mean what we believe individually. I don't want to give you my beliefs. I want you to believe. I want you to have a faith that is personal to you. And so you may come out the end of this and believe some of the same things I do, and you may believe differently than I do, and that's okay. And so my hope for us is that we take the next several weeks to just get a better understanding of our personal faith and what we believe as progressive evangelical Christians. And so what's coming up next is a very short video that I put together for seminary for a class that I was doing, and it's just basically an introduction to theology. And so I'm going to share this video with you, and then at the end of this, I will give you a little bit of a wrap-up and perhaps some things to think about and reflect upon before we meet again next Wednesday. So here goes a short intro to theology.
Let's talk about God. You know, the old white guy in the sky, Jesus on the side of the mount, preaching to the people. The resurrected Christ ascended into heaven. You know, God. When we think about God, there are numerous names and representations that come to mind. God, Father, Elohim, Holy Spirit, Lord, King, Son of Man, Jesus, Yahweh, and there's so many more. But right now, I want you to set aside all of those names and those representations and begin with a clean slate. On this slate, we hope to draw a new picture of God, one that expresses your theology. Before we begin, let's set some groundwork, and there's a lot of ground to cover. First, the word theology comes from the Greek roots theos and logos. Theos meaning God, and logos meaning teaching. But there's more. Theology is not simply a teaching or theory about God. The object of theology can only be the relationship between God and human beings. In other words, reflection on the experiences that have compelled human beings to talk about something like God. Reflections on those experiences led to three basic categories of theology: orthodox, liberal, and radical. Orthodox theology finds its beginning in the Bible, and more specifically the truth revealed by Jesus Christ in the Gospels. Then there's liberal theology. The European Enlightenment brought about liberal theology. Zola mentions three premises of liberal theology: the validity of science, the historicity of religion, and the unity of culture and religion. Liberal theology was primarily a theology of white, fairly well-to-do men. There was a response, and that response came from those who were excluded, and this response was a radical theology, a theology that finds liberation for the oppressed. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. Theology addresses God's relationship with humanity, and humanity is diverse in many ways: gender, race, and ethnicity, just to name a few. So as we construct an understanding of God's relationship with humanity, we begin to create a picture of God's nature. When discussing God's nature, we look at two essential qualities: transcendence and immanence. Transcendence is what theologian Elizabeth Johnson calls God's otherness beyond imagination. This is how we experience the mystery of God. Immanence, on the other hand, is described as the nearness of God beyond all imagination. Together, transcendence and immanence describe a God that is both out there somewhere as well as present with us here, a God that is both mysterious and personal.
So as you can see, there is a lot to cover in theology. One of the very first things mentioned in that little short video was what we call God. And what we call God has great meaning to us, and sometimes that meaning can be negative. For example, referring to God as king. Kings and monarchies throughout the centuries have been oppressive, and so we don't want to think about God as a king if what comes to mind is oppression. We may not want to think about God as a man. Does God have gender? Is God female? Is God male? I don't know that we can make that judgment. But, taking that into consideration when we think about what we're going to call God is important. Certainly in church, Andrew and I, we do our best to refer to God in gender-neutral terms. Because assigning gender to God puts one gender over the other, and that is not how we were created. We were created as equals, and so that's one of the things to consider when we discuss God. What do we want to call God? And so that may be the first thing that we think about, or it may be something that you may not find all that important at this point. But that's part of building your theology. We talked about in that video, we mentioned that, theology really is about relationship between God and human beings. And so, part of developing, this theology is coming to understand who you think God is in your life. And, what experiences, in your life actually influence how you see God. So, for example, when we talk about liberation theology or radical theology, God may have, my experiences say as someone who has been oppressed, if I were oppressed, might have a different impact on how I view God. I might view God as a liberator, right? I might view God as someone who speaks for the poor. Our experiences are going to shape how we view God. And we must remember, though, that the very nature of God is incomprehensible, right? God is so big and so beyond anything that we can know or understand that it is difficult to come up with descriptions or understandings that are fully right and fully formed. Right? We cannot really have a complete understanding of God, but we can work towards that. And so, I want to encourage you to take God out of any sort of box that you've put God in. Take God out of the limits and the boundaries that you have put around God. For example, if you see God as a being, as a person, think about whether or not that is limiting God. If you see God as someone that you can turn to find a parking space, or to, make sure that you get a promotion, or if God is someone who you turn to when the weather is bad. I mean, just think about whether or not that is limiting who and what God is, because God is a mystery and God is an experience that is beyond anything that we can understand, and our understanding of God will always fall short of who God is, and so I want you to keep that in mind as you begin to form your ideas and your beliefs around who and what God is. Two of the things that we talk about when we talk about God are transcendence and immanence. And if you remember from that little short video, Transcendence is that otherness of God, right? It's that mystery of God. It's God's incomprehensible nature, and so it's sometimes it may be easy to see God as transcendent, to see God beyond anything that we can understand. There is, of course, a danger in doing that, because when we think about God as something we can't understand or as something that is incomprehensible, it may put God out of reach. And so that's where we turn to immanence. We look for, how do we find God in our lives today, or how do we describe the nearness of God? And so, one of the ways that we do that is we find God in the person of Jesus, right? Jesus brings God closer to us. And so, another one of the things that we want to think about when we are constructing our idea of God is, how far is God from us, and how close is God to us? God obviously is this incomprehensible thing, this enormous thing that we can't put our arms around or our minds around. But then again, God is here with us in the person of Jesus, right? God is with us in the Holy Spirit. And so we experience God maybe through other people and what they say or what they do. And so there are ways that we find God nearer to us, and at the same time where God is beyond anything that we can understand. And so transcendence and immanence are two things that are a way to describe God as a mystery as well as something that is personal to us. So I'd like you to just kind of think about those things as we prepare for next week, when we'll talk more about the nature of God and who God is to us personally. So just please consider, how close is God to you? How do you experience God in your life? And how far is God? How big is God? How incomprehensible is God? What is your view of God's nature? And also think about, how do you refer to God? Is it appropriate to apply a gender to God? So look for another video next week, and we will dive a little bit deeper into the nature of God, look a little bit closer at transcendence and immanence, and try to really begin to put together our own understanding of who God is in our life, and what God means to us today. So I hope this is a good starting point for you to start reflecting upon what it is you believe. And in the weeks to come, we'll look at things like sin and the resurrection and the crucifixion. We will look at salvation, and we'll just try to put together what it is we believe as progressive Christians. And I hope to be able to show you that there are so many, I don't want to say options, but the possibilities of what this Christian faith means are just, they are vast and limitless. And so I don't want you to think that you are stuck with that conservative evangelical view that you were raised with, or that Catholic view, or that Methodist view. You are not stuck with any of those. There is room for you and for your beliefs at Mission Gathering and in God's kingdom. And so join me next week as we just get a little bit deeper into who God is and what God means to us.